On a narrow point of land that reaches down into Lake Bolmen from the north, there lies an old manor called Tyraholm, usually called just Tyra. Long, long ago there was a knight who lived there with his wife and their only child, the beautiful girl Malfrid. She was the most lovely maiden in the entire kingdom, and rumor of her beauty spread far and wide, luring many suitors to Tyraholm. But Malfrid was indifferent and cold, and she dismissed them all, one after the other. One day a rider, splendid and gallant, rode up to the manor. His name was Ebbe Skammelsson, and he had recently returned from foreign lands where he had earned his golden spurs and been dubbed a full-fledged knight. With furtive, downcast eyes and cheeks blushing red, maiden Malfrid offered her hand to the stranger in greeting, who courteously took it and greeted the lady in a most chivalrous manner. The knight stayed as a guest in Tyraholm, and soon it was announced that Ebbe and the fair Malfrid would be wed, dashing the hopes of many a young bachelor. But as the betrothed were still quite young, the knight intended to first join a crusade to the Holy Land, and thereby win even greater glory. So it was decided that the wedding would wait, and celebrated first after Ebbe Skammelsson returned in triumph. Some time after Ebbe rode away, the old knight, Malfrid's father, died, and his daughter was left alone with her mother in Tyraholm. Year after year passed without a word from Ebbe. The roses on Malfrid's cheeks faded, and her dark eyes lost their sparkle. Her mother was deeply saddened by Malfrid's sorrow and longing, and so she made arrangements for Malfrid to marry another. In the belief that the knight Ebbe Skammelsson had fallen to the swords of unbelievers, she prepared now a festive wedding, and the newly engaged were made man and wife through the sacrament of holy matrimony. But just as the wedding party took their seats, a knight all in gold galloped into the yard. The bride went pale under her tiara, but her mother, who saw that this man was Ebbe, hurried forward to exchange words and remind him that 7 years had passed, and that his betrothed was now the bride of another. In wrath he turned his horse, drew his sword, and after rebuking the faithlessness of the woman who was once to be his mother-in-law, he beheaded her with a single stroke. With his sword dripping, he jumped out of the saddle and into the wedding hall, where the bride fell to his blade, and after another swift stroke, the bridegroom joined her in death. Suddenly struck with remorse, the murderer leapt onto his horse and rode away into the pathless woods, but his conscience gave him no peace. Night and day he saw the shades of his victims, and there was nowhere he could go where they would not follow. Finally, he resolved to journey to Rome, and there at the feet of the Holy Father himself confess his sins and beg for forgiveness. And for a large sum of money, he did in fact receive a letter of indulgence from the Pope, but the forgiveness of men was not able to still the anguish of his soul, nor quiet the storm in his heart. He returned to the homeland of his betrothed, and begged the judge to sentence him with the hardest doom under the law. After much discussion, the assembled court decided that he, Ebbe Skammelsson, would be fettered with 130 pounds of iron, and would, thus encumbered, spend 1 day on each and every one of Bolmen's 65 islets. The sentence was put into effect at once. To move himself, he had a small boat, and on that boat he dragged himself like a wounded bird from one islet to the other. When the punishment was complete, he came ashore at Angelstad in Sunderbo. Here he staggered into the village and cast himself down in a barn to sleep. Meanwhile, the sad fate of Ebbe Skammelsson had made a deep impression on the people. A folk singer had written a song about his misfortune, and a fortune-teller had foretold that when he heard that song for himself, his chains would fall off and he would die. And that morning, while he lay hidden in the barn, a maid walked in to milk the cows, singing the lay of Ebbe Skammelsson. Ebbe listened intently, and when the final verse was sung, he shouted, "Some of it's true, and some of it isn't." Frightened out of her mind, the maid jumped up and ran back to the house, telling the people inside what had just happened. Quickly, the villagers gathered around the barn where Ebbe lay, and asked him to tell them where he came from and who he was. Still fettered with 130 pounds of iron, he dragged himself out onto the grass and told them his name, then asked to be taken to the cemetery. Between the village and the church in Angelstad, there is a huge rock, and when the group reached the place where it lies, Ebbe climbed up onto it, raised his eyes to heaven, and cried, "If I am worthy to rest in the church's holy ground, then please let it be so." The fetters fell from Ebbe's hands and feet, and he sank to the earth, dead. The villagers who were with him took his body and brought it to the cemetery, where they buried him under the walkway, but outside the cemetery itself, so that everybody who went into the graveyard would tread upon his grave. The following night there was a sign or omen, because a long stretch of the cemetery wall collapsed right in front of the new grave. The farmers quickly set it in order, but again the following night it fell once more. Then it was clear to everyone that the wall collapsing was a sign from heaven, and that the outlaw should be allowed to rest in the church's cemetery. So the local officials added land to the graveyard and moved the wall so that Ebbe lay within its bounds, and to this day there stands a stone to mark his final resting place. The fetters, which they say hung in Angelstad's church for a long time, were forged into 3 iron crosses that were put up on the current church's roof, and which look like those crosses they set up in the old days in memory of the dead.